My name is Omar. We're here at Functional Core Fitness, and today we're covering exercise 10 of the Independence Through Movement series. All right, exercise 10, the hip hinge. So today we're going to focus on the hip hinge and the importance of the hip hinge. And anytime that we squat, we have to hip hinge, or else we will be using our back, our spine, and that's going to be extremely vulnerable and keeps us vulnerable to injury. So we want to make sure that we use the hip hinge. So what is the hip hinge? Well, the hip hinge is this movement right here. Boom. That's all it is. And then I drive my hips forward to straighten my hips out. Now when I walk, or when I stand, or when I perform movement, depending on the movement, I want to make sure that my shoulders are always stacked above my hips. Once I level change, I do not arch my back. I want to hinge my back. When I hip hinge, I also want to make sure that my knees are soft. I don't hip hinge and lock my knees. I hip hinge and bend and slightly bend my knees. I don't continuously to bend my knees unless I am sitting on something. But for the hip hinge, knees are soft, hips are moving. Always remember, the hips move. The spine stabilizes. So you're not using any arching at the back, because that's where our spine becomes vulnerable and injuries happen when we're vulnerable. So we want to make sure that we hip hinge. Now, when we hip hinge or when we squat, depending on the squat, whether it's a double leg squat, whether it's a split stance squat, or whether it's a hip hinge, anytime that I do any time of those movements in not only the gym, but in the outside world, always remember to hip hinge. So let me give you an example. If I were picking something off the floor, we normally do things in an asymmetrical position. I wouldn't go up to something in a squared position and then pick something up. Some might, but it's not, for a lot of people, that's not natural. They'll normally step up to it in an asymmetrical position, and then they would squat, hopefully squat, not just bend over, squat to pick something up. And when they squat to pick something up in that asymmetrical position, I don't just come down. My hips hinge, and I finish my squat. But if you notice, my back is straight, I'm not arching. If I can keep my back straight, my hips will do all the work. So today, hip hinge. I'm going to show you how to hip hinge, not only in a square position, but also in a split stance position. Another thing I want to discuss before we get into the hip hinge exercise, we want to make sure that the hips are in a proper position. Now, proper position means I want to make sure that my hips, right here, are level to the ground. If my hips are tilting like this, right, where my front side is going forward, back side is going up, this is called an anterior pelvic tilt. Now you can see that my hips are far out, away from my shoulders, okay? It has become the norm that people's hips are usually in that position, and it's usually due to constant sitting. So when you sit down too much, these muscles, your hip flexors, become very tight. And when your hip flexors become tight, your lower back becomes tight, and that shifts the hips. That's an anterior pelvic tilt. Now the opposite direction of the hips, where my butt goes down, my front portion of my pelvis goes up, that's called a posterior pelvic tilt. Now that's the opposite direction, where my hips are under and my shoulders are over. So you can see that my knees are bent, right, and my weight is on my heels. Where when I'm in an anterior pelvic tilt, I'm more on the balls of my feet. I want to make sure that my hips are in a neutral position. So posterior, anterior, neutral, right in the center. Now if I squeeze my butt, my hips didn't move. So this is the neutral hip position. So once my hips are neutral, now I can hip hinge. I wouldn't want to hip hinge from a posterior pelvic tilt, right? Now I'm just rounding my back and kind of rolling. If I anterior pelvic tilt and hip hinge, I'm gonna do the opposite where I'm arching my back. So anytime that you feel any lower back pain from any exercise, it's most likely your hips are out of alignment, and most likely you're not in a neutral spine. So for the exercise, a hip hinge, if you have tight hamstrings, this is the best thing you can do for it. Because the more that you hip hinge and mimic the movement, the more that you're gonna stretch the hamstrings. So your hip hinge is as follows. I'm in a neutral position, and then I'm going to drive my hips back. Now, as I drive my hips back, I'm gonna stop right here. I don't need to go further than that. And then I'm gonna drive my hips forward. As I drive my hips forward, I'm going to squeeze my glutes. And as I squeeze my glutes, I'm gonna finish the hip hinge by squeezing them nice and tight. I'm going to release the glute tension when I push back for my second repetition. There you go, now I've released. Okay, I'm going to use my hands to mimic the activation of my butt. Now, once I stop the hip hinge, I'm going to drive my hips forward. As I drive, I'm going to slowly clench, 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 clench to finish the movement. You can see that my hands are fully clenched. Those are my glute muscles. And as I hip hinge again, I extend, I extend, I extend. Now, one way that I teach this hip hinge position when sometimes the connection between the brain and the hips are not connected yet, what I like to do is I like to create a frame. Now, what are frames? Frames in this situation would be my hands on my knees. This is called a sports ready position. I'm sure you've seen baseball players always in this position. This is a sports ready. And the reason why it's a sports ready is because my hips are down, my back is straight, and I'm ready to go. I can cut to the left, I can cut to the right. My hips are in the right position. If I'm tall and I have to cut, I have to get into position, then cut. It takes too much time. That's why that sports ready position is that, because the hips are low. Okay, so the frames. What I want to do is I'm going to maintain the hands on my thighs. As I hip hinge, I'm going to slide my hands down to my knees. If I can maintain connection with the hands, maintain my elbows straight, my hip hinge and my back should work properly. So I'm sliding, 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 sliding. I can rest my hands on my knees. Now I can feel that I overarched my back. So I'm going to correct that there. Okay, so now this frame can assist my hips properly hip hinging. I want to make sure that I squeeze my glutes. I can't emphasize that enough. The hip hinge, to drive my hips forward after the hip hinge, is the whole reason why you have a butt. Your butt cheeks were designed to hip hinge, and that is your driver. So you want to make sure that you really connect the glutes to the movement, because no matter what you do, whether it's a lunge, a squat, single leg, whatever it may be, a walk, your glutes are going to be your driver. So make sure that every single time that you do a completion of a hip hinge or a squat, emphasize the glutes, squeeze them hard. If you don't squeeze them, pretend that it doesn't count, the repetition doesn't count. So always use the glutes to finish the movement. It is not a lean back. My back stays straight, my glutes drive my hips forward. emphasize the hips, emphasize the glutes. It might look funny, but I can guarantee you, you're gonna increase the strength of your glutes if you do it. And the glutes are your driver. And that's why we train smart, we train hard, and we stay independent. I'll see you guys next week.